Live in just a second. All right, you're up, Larry.
All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Houston Archaeological Society meeting. Tonight's speaker will be Dr. Mary Prendergast. She's an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Rice. She was a recipient of a newly constructed or renovated archaeological lab at the university. And she's going to give us a virtual tour of the new laboratory and talk about what's going on. So, Mary, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Larry, and thanks everybody for inviting me to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if this does not work. There we go. So I have prepared a virtual tour. I want to apologize in advance because I had hoped to do it physically from the lab, but we have been doing construction in the building and it's messing with our technology. And so instead, what I've done is I've included a lot of images of the lab in hopes that that will compensate. And of course, many of you have been there before, although it might have been before the renovations. And of course, you're welcome to visit us anytime. So tonight, what I wanted to do is introduce the lab. Very, very, very recently named the Rice Archaeology and Learning Laboratory, or RALI. We basically spent a year looking for a good acronym and a little bit less than a year looking for a good logo. So, you know, branding still in progress. I want to talk about the fauna collection donated by Bill McClure, somebody who I'm sure many of you knew, and then talk about what I do in that space, especially in terms of undergraduate instruction, and then how we're applying those skills to the archaeology of foodways at Varner-Hogg Plantation. And what I really wanted to do tonight, this is my first meeting of the Houston Archaeological Society, and I'm a newcomer to Houston and to Texas archaeology, is kind of think through with you what some possible future collaborations or research opportunities might look like. So I also wanted to kind of introduce myself and just sort of position myself as the outsider that I am here. What I do as an archaeologist is I specialize in foodways, so studying not just what people ate in the past, but what that can tell us about social behavior and social relationships, environments, etc. And then, of course, I'm a zooarchaeologist, so I study faunal remains and basically use this to think about the interaction between people and animals and environments. And I really work across the last 125,000 years of human history. What enables me to have such long time depth is that I am an Africanist. So I work in a couple different locations across the African continent, primarily in Kenya and Tanzania. And in the last 5 years or so, I've really shifted my research focus towards biomolecular archaeology. So ancient proteins, ancient DNA, stable isotopes, lipid residues, right? All of these sort of biomolecular applications of our work. And that, of course, has brought me into questions about the ethics of such research, especially if human remains are involved, and then how the archaeological science movement is interfacing with museum studies and curatorial practices. And that informs a lot of what I teach, because I'm also teaching museum studies at Rice. So all of that is a very long way to say that I am very far from home. All of my archaeological training was in African archaeology or European or Asian archaeology to a lesser extent. And I've spent the last 16 years of my life living in Madrid, Spain, and I arrived in Texas just last year. So I'm sort of prefacing with that to say that although all of Texas historical archaeology is new to me, what I'm hoping to do is sort of empower my students with skills that are highly transferable across different places and times in the past, and that can be applied to a number of sites here in the immediate area around Rice. Now, as Larry mentioned, my talk is really focusing on the lab at Rice, a space I think many of you may have been familiar with in its previous incarnations. This is the old lab as we were cleaning it up and getting it ready for total demolition and renovation. It was a perfectly functional space, but has really been transformed. Everything from flooring to asbestos removal to new fixtures, the whole 9 yards. And this is what the space looks like now. So it is just a fantastic place to be able to work on collections. And I know several members of HAS already have been coming in and working with maybe Dr. Molly Morgan, or I've interacted with a few of you, and you've interacted with our students as we start to use this new space in different ways. So that's what I wanted to talk about to start off today, is what we're doing in this space and what potentially can be done in the space. So it is called the Rice Archaeology Learning Lab, and the focus is absolutely on undergraduate teaching and learning. But of course, part of that, and I think what's great about Rice, is we give students an opportunity to do primary research as well. Sorry, I'm just going to mute myself for a second to tell my kids to turn their volume down. Oh, I can't mute myself without messing around. One second. Sorry about that. So these folks will be very familiar to you. I just want to make sure I didn't miss a slide here. No, I did not. Louis and Linda came to the lab, and we filmed a little movie, which I would encourage all of you to watch. If you just Google this title, it will pop up in YouTube. That gives you a little bit more of an insight into the lab. And our focus in that news story that Rice did was really on the donation by HAS of the fauna collection that I think many of you will know about, that had been accumulated and cared for over the years by the late Bill McClure. And I cannot emphasize enough how fundamental this collection is to everything that we're now trying to do in the laboratory in terms of teaching and research. Any of you who've done zooarchaeology will know that you really cannot do it without a comparative collection of modern skeletons for reference. And so Bill McClure, because of his work with the, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but the Highways Division, I can't remember, Public Works, I can't remember the right acronym right now, had encountered lots of roadkill and other dead animals that then he skeletonized and cared for and curated exceptionally well to create this amazing collection. So you see a few shots here of how the collection is arranged, and the plaque that we created for it to recognize that donation, and some of the materials from the collection out here on the lab bench. A student of mine last summer took the time to really organize this material. For those of you who had seen it previously, all the skeletons were packed in Ziploc bags in a small number of banker boxes. And so what we did is we really just expanded that to make it much more accessible and usable for students. So now every individual animal has its own, if it's not its own tray, as this sheep does, then a couple of trays within trays, as these goats do. It's all nicely organized by taxonomic order, with little pictures to make it easy to identify, because students generally don't know the Latin names of animals and don't necessarily know where in the taxonomy they should be looking for things. And so now it's real easy, if you ever need to use this as a reference collection for any of your own work, to come on in here and pull out a tray, and you've got your whole individual laid out and grouped by skeletal element. So it's now just so much more useful than it was previously. And Bill had included all of these notes with each individual specimen. So, we often get a little bit of information. For example, this alligator, right, found decomposed. Here it's spine spot. Here it's got a length plus or minus 8 feet. And this is great. This is exactly the kind of information that we need. And it's great that we can get it even from deceased animals where you may not have had a lot of information about them in life, as we sometimes get with some reference collections. So Bill has left these tags with every single individual, and it's really a great record. Back in the 90s, I believe it was, maybe early 2000s, a Rice undergraduate went through this collection and went through all of those cards and created a basic database I tracked down that former undergraduate who is still working in database management and amazingly managed to locate and process and put this database into Excel so that I could use it. And that was really wonderful. And this is not yet live on our website because the Rice Lab website is still under construction, but I have it. If anybody wants to know what's in the collection, please just email me and I'm really happy to share this with you. And what we're moving towards, hopefully in the next year, is having a lab website where this database will be accessible so that people know what's available and what they can access. And another thing I'm hoping to do soon is establish partnerships with other zooarchaeology labs around Texas. I've been talking with some of the zooarchaeologists at different universities so that we all sort of know what's in each other's collections and can create those networks of collaboration. On that note, I will say that although the collection is fantastic and truly fundamental to doing any Texas zooarchaeology, highly, highly relevant, for example, to Varner-Hogg Plantation, which I'll talk about in a moment, there are still really important gaps. So we have gaps in taxonomic diversity. We do have most of the major domestic mammals, a lot of Texas wild mammals, especially smaller fauna, so your rodents, your small carnivores, but there are pretty big gaps, and certainly we are lacking fauna from outside of Texas. So I have a graduate student, Maggie Katongo, who is working, she's from Zambia, and she's working on an assemblage from Malawi right now. And to some extent, a bovid is a bovid, and she can look at a pronghorn antelope from Texas and say, okay, I'm going to use this as a proxy for African antelope. But ideally, we want to grow this collection and increase not just taxonomic diversity within Texas fauna, but global diversity. And that's multi-year, multi-decade effort ahead of us. Skeletal completeness is really important. So I only have half a horse. You know, it would be nice to have the other half. And a range of both age and sex. So super important for students who are learning zooarchaeology. Often they're looking at clues like size, and size is something that varies widely. Obviously, there's sexual dimorphism. Bones look different if they came from a male or a female animal. Age can influence size. When students are first learning how to identify bones, unfused bones of juvenile animals often really trip them up. So we need a range of animal ages all the way from infantile to very old so they can learn about epiphyseal fusion, tooth wear, right? All of these clues that a zooarchaeologist really needs. So we still have a long way to go to grow this collection. And I mention this because I know some of you may know folks who have access to places where animals die, right? Or know a taxidermist who's, discarding bones on a regular basis. At this point, I don't need a ton more deer, but pretty much anything else, especially larger mammals, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, horses. We would love to grow that collection, and I'm certainly interested in trying to acquire carcasses. So if you have any leads, please reach out to me. I'd be very grateful. Okay, so more about the collection. I do not have a lot of material from outside of Texas, except for this modern collection that I made in Tanzania back when I was a graduate student. So that's what we use for studying taphonomy. So breakage patterns, right? Fracture patterns, cut marks, tooth marks, etc. Because this is a really great collection that involves animals that were butchered by people and then deposited and then ravaged by hyenas. And so this is pretty typical of what you might find in some earlier sites, right? So if anybody here is doing early Holocene archaeology, for example, and thinking about taphonomy and modification of bone and trying to sort out human versus carnivore action on bones, that's where you really need a good taphonomic reference collection. And that's largely what we use this for. And again, I'm hoping in the future to do more experiments. And if anybody's interested in doing this, definitely reach out. Always looking for people who want to have fun butchering animals and cooking them and banging, rocks on bones to open them up and boiling them for marrow and feeding them to dogs or other carnivores. because that kind of taphonomic experimental reference collection is, again, critical both to teaching and to research. So there's lots to do in our future. I've also been slowly acquiring mounted skeletons because one thing I've realized is that although they take up a lot of space and they're not terribly useful in the sense that you can't pick up a bone and twist it around and look at it, students often don't know how these bones articulate with one another, right? They're not familiar with the complete skeleton. So mounted skeletons are really important teaching tools, and I'm slowly acquiring a bunch to sort of scatter throughout the lab. We also have other spaces and equipment that I wanted you all to know about in case there's ever interest or an opportunity in working together on something. One is, of course, storage space. And oops, sorry, you'll be familiar with this because we have quite a lot of HAS material that I think over the long term has been stored here. We don't have a lot more storage space to grow, but we're certainly happy to curate materials here. We have lots of space for processing artifacts, so washing, drying, all the messy stuff can happen in our space. We've got microscopes, and I should be acquiring more of those soon. Here's Dr. Jeff Fleischer, who I think many of you will know at Rice, using our new light table. We've got a light box as well, so really great for artifact photography. I'm hoping to acquire a 3D scanner. We do have the room set up, even though I'm not there tonight, for fully hybrid lecture capabilities. So we do hope in the future to be able to invite guest speakers into our space. And we've set up a library. And in particular, I want to thank Carol McDavid and Susan McIntosh, again, two archaeologists who many of you will know, for having donated so many books to our little lending library, which obviously is also going to grow. So that's sort of an overview of what the lab is. And now I want to kind of shift and without taking too much of your time, just talk briefly about what am I teaching in the lab, and then how are students applying these skills to the Varner-Hogg faunal assemblage. So I began teaching zooarchaeology last fall. It is such a fun class. I don't know how many people listening tonight are zooarchaeologists or who have done some zooarch. Any of you who have experience with this know how much fun it is to play with bones and how satisfying it is to teach this stuff, because students come in typically knowing very little about skeletal anatomy and just come out feeling like they've learned so much, because now I can put some bones in front of them and they know what they are. And it's just figuring out a puzzle. And I think, and I hope students walk away with a real sense of satisfaction. So we have this excellent space for doing teaching and identification practice, lots of space for hands-on work. The course I teach is basically no lecture, some discussion, mostly fully hands-on practice. So for example, in this picture, you can see that this was one of our early things. I asked students to just lay out a skeleton, right? Take the bones and try to lay them out in anatomical order, and you'd be amazed how hard that is, right? If you've never done it before, or if you haven't done it in a long time. Students work in pairs or in groups and are assigned different stations where they have different tasks. They have to go around the lab and do those stations over the course of a week, and at the end of the week, they have a quiz. In addition, of course, there's some theory, so they do some readings. I had them work in groups to make all sorts of fun posters on these giant 3D Post-its that we put around the lab, from very, very basic questions in the beginning of the semester, like what kinds of things can you learn from animal bones, to more complicated questions about taphonomy and assemblage formation, as well as the ethics of destructive analysis, especially since we are in this biomolecular archaeology boom, if you will. And then, of course, the heart of this class is the stations. So this would not be possible without the donation of the Bill McClure collection. I have them going around the room, observing specific features. They have a handout to do this. Making comparisons across taxa on the same features. I should just add, in case you're concerned, that in case you're wondering, I'm teaching only with casts of human remains. I'm not teaching with real human remains in this course. I do use casts, and I do a 1-week session on human osteology as well. I should, on that same note, mention that we have an amazing cast collection of hominin fossils, so mostly fossil crania. But if you are interested in looking at the hominin fossil record, and as an Africanist, of course, I am interested in this, we have quite a good collection there as well. And then the quizzes are, you know, as you see here, they have to identify all this stuff and tell me some things about each of these bones and the types of features they can observe. So it's a very challenging and intense course. It is a lot of fun to teach. If there's interest in the future from HAS, I'd be happy to offer a workshop in the lab to interested members, right? I think there's lots of scope here for doing more than just teaching this course, which I do only once every 2 years, due to the small size of our program and the number of courses that we all have to offer. So then my students, as their project for this course, applied their newfound skills to an archaeological site and a set of research questions. And I'm so proud of them, because if you think about it, this is extremely hard. They entered the semester at the end of August, having never touched animal bones before in their lives, in most cases. And by the end of the semester, I was expecting them to put together a pretty good, and it was like a 20-page, well-illustrated faunal report with all the typical tables and figures you would expect. So I can't stress enough how hard they worked and how much I think they accomplished. And yet, as you'll see, there's still a very long way to go, of course. So they applied these skills to faunal remains provided to us by the Texas Historical Commission from the Varner-Hogg Plantation in Brazoria County. And I know that Catherine Jalbert gave an excellent talk, which I had all my students watch at the HAS meeting, I think towards the end of last year. I can't remember quite. And so many of you are already quite familiar with this site, and I don't plan to go into tremendous detail, except just to remind you that this is a site that was associated with sugar production from, I think, about the 1830s to the 70s, and later with cotton, ranching, oil, and other businesses, and of course, ultimately wound up in the Hogg family and then donated to the state. The work at Rice has really focused on the stories of people who were involved in what we're calling, as a general term, captive or exploitative labor. So that includes people who were enslaved. It also includes people who labored under the convict leasing system. And later on, there were also other occupants who were sharecroppers, but most of the excavations have focused on areas that we think were occupied by those who were enslaved, and potentially from those who were involved in the convict leasing. Excavations at Varner-Hogg have been pretty intermittent. They were intensive between 1979 and 1981. And then occasionally, and as needs arose, there were excavations often focused on mitigation at the site. And then, as you know, from if you've seen Catherine Jalbert's talk, there were new excavations launched in 2020, a cooperation between the THC and Rice University. And in 2020, and just now, oh no, what year is it? It's 2022. Sorry, I might be mixing up my years. In 2021 and 2022, and 2020, so that's 3 field seasons, I suppose. I might be wrong about this. The pandemic has really screwed things up. There have been excavations of a structure or structures that are believed to be associated with occupation by enslaved laborers. So one thing I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the site, but I want to emphasize no zooarchaeological study has been done at the site until now, despite the fact that there's a very, very large faunal assemblage. But of course, we all know how much time it takes to analyze material that gets excavated, and that often there's a lot of material that doesn't get excavated, right? This is something we're all super familiar with. And so no faunal analysis have been done. And in fact, the only comparable faunal analysis is at the Levi Jordan Plantation, which that work is written up in a senior honors thesis by Kristen Hickey, who graduated from Rice in 2020, I believe. So our goals, the goals of my class, were I asked them to read a lot of literature on the archaeology of slavery, historical zooarchaeology in the United States. In particular, we read some of the zooarchaeology from Montpelier, And we talked about what kinds of research questions we could ask of this faunal assemblage. And so some of the questions are very basic. You know, we don't know anything about this assemblage. And you know how this is. You open a box and it's like, well, what's going to be inside? Are we going to have anything to work with here? How can we characterize the fauna of the site as a whole? How can we do some basic analyses to lay the foundations for future work? Are there major differences between the main house and the captive labor context? So the main house, of course, were the plantation owners, their visitors, guests. Captive labor context, again, would have involved enslaved laborers, potentially later convict laborers. I'm saying potentially because there's actually still a lot of kind of unknowns about the context and the chronological resolution of some of the fauna that we're looking at. And so I want to be careful to say we're having trouble at the moment distinguishing between different phases of occupation at the site. And so some of the questions that come up and come out of the literature on the zooarchaeology of African American foodways and of plantations are there differences between enslaved and enslaving populations in terms of diet, in terms of wild versus domestic animals. Some studies, for example, at Monticello, showed that enslaved people were more likely to diversify their diet through self-provisioning, hunting, trapping, and fishing, as opposed to plantation owners who typically had a diet exclusively consisting of domestic fauna, typically beef and pork. Are there differences in these groups in terms of their access to quality cuts of meat? And are there differences in culinary practices? And so these are the questions we aim to answer. I'm going to show you the results in a second, and just caution to say, as in any archaeological project, you often start off with bigger questions than the data can help you answer at this juncture. But I think over the years, we will be able to accumulate enough data to really rigorously test these different ideas. And then we hope to eventually be able to compare our data against other lines of evidence from Levi Jordan as the only directly comparable zooarchaeological study of which I personally am aware. You may know some that I should be aware of. Look at potentially other sources of information that have been used in other plantation contexts elsewhere in the United States. For example, written histories, oral histories, recipe books, inventories or receipts. And then think about the long-term potential for additional analyses of this fauna. For example, I think it would be really amazing if we have a strontium isoscape to do some strontium analysis and look at livestock mobility across the landscape as a way of understanding ranching practices, right? These kinds of questions. And then to what extent can our data speak more broadly about historical African American foodways, which we now know from the literature to be extremely diverse across space and time in the Southern United States. So we focused our work last fall on the material from the earliest excavations at Varner-Hogg, main house, picnic loop, and structures 1 and 2. So the main house is, as it sounds, the main house, right, where plantation owners lived. Structures 1 and 2 were originally named by the excavators the slave cabins. And the reason I'm not using that term here is just because there are some questions about what the function of these structures is and how many different groups of people may have lived there over time. So for now, I'm cautiously calling them structures 1 and 2, although these are the structures we think are most likely to have been where enslaved laborers lived. And then the picnic loop, if you've been to Varner-Hogg, you'll know this is a loop around which you can picnic, which was between the structures and the sugar mill. And so we consider that part of enslaved labor contexts. And there's quite a lot of faunal material. It's pretty well preserved, especially anything from the main house seems to have been protected by that structure. Extraordinarily well curated, organized, and labeled by THC or TPWD, who originally excavated it. But we are missing some information about how different contexts are related to each other across horizontal space and vertical space. And of course, a lot of the excavations took place with the goal of mitigation and without the same research questions that we have in mind now. And then of course, we've got the new data from Rice, in particular from something called Structure 3. And again, you may have heard about this in Catherine Jalbert's talk. This is adjacent to Structures 1 and 2, or immediately next door, I should say. And again, is thought to be associated with enslaved laborers. So although the faunal material is more limited so far, and seems to have been subjected to perhaps more trampling, soil compaction, we're not sure, but just fragmentation seems a bit higher. We do have excellent context control, of course, because we're excavating it right now, and we can sort of see for ourselves what the contexts are and what the relationships are. And then, of course, the goals of the excavation are very much tied to the same questions that we have for this project. So students used pretty standard run-of-the-mill zooarchaeological techniques. If any of you have done zooarch, you'll be very familiar with these. Basic quantification and sorting. My students, because they are relatively inexperienced with fauna, excuse me, we're sorting into what we call maximally identifiable, your teeth, your epiphyses, minimally identifiable, limb shafts, ribs, and just not identifiable stuff that just seems not worth anybody's time, little tiny chunks of bone scraps. They did the best they could to identify these skeletal elements, portions, and sides, right? Left proximal femur, those kinds of things. Taxonomic identification, estimating age at death where possible using epiphyseal fusion or tooth wear, making notes on preservation. And my great mistake was not teaching them how to identify bone surface modifications like cut marks and tooth marks until towards the end of the semester. So they hadn't learned what they needed to learn in order to identify bone surface modifications. And so I think we wound up underreporting those. So lesson learned, I will teach this differently next time. But I bring this up because I want to emphasize that they were learning how to do this as they were doing it. So of course there are limits. And this was my first experience with a group analysis, where as a group we constructed a database, and I had 9 or 10 different analysts contributing to that database, 10 I think. And of course we're limited by the limits in the comparative collections I mentioned earlier. I want to spotlight one of the students in the class because she went the extra mile and did her senior honors thesis on Varner-Hogg fauna. So after all the other students finished their work basically around Thanksgiving last year and wrote it up for early December, Natalie Festa continued all through winter break, spent her winter break in the lab. And next week we'll be defending her senior honors thesis, which was supported by a Council of Texas Archaeologists grant, and which has been really outstanding. So I'm gonna talk about the work of the class as a whole, but also spotlight Natalie's research a little bit. So this is work done by the initial class in November, December. They, again, are learning just for the first time how to generate graphs from zooarchaeological data. And I think a couple things will jump out at you. And if we just focus on this one, you'll see that there's far more domestic fauna in what they call the mansion group or the main house group than in what we later wound up calling the captive labor context. And again, over here, you'll notice if we just think about number of colors as representing taxonomic diversity, there's far greater taxonomic diversity in the captive labor context than in the main house. So immediately, this is kind of saying, oh, hey, these ideas we've seen in the literature at other plantation sites about enslaved laborers perhaps self-provisioning through hunting, fishing, trapping, etc., might be playing out at Varner-Hogg as well. The types of animals present are, I know they're probably not eating longhorns, but like I am an Africanist, and this was my first chance to put a longhorn on a slide, but they probably were not longhorns that were being eaten, but other cattle. Pigs, right? So again, beef and pork are the two main large domestic mammals that are being eaten, but a substantial and I think sometimes unappreciated component of fowl. So chickens, geese, and ducks. It's possible the geese and ducks are wild and not domestic. We don't know. And it might be fairly difficult to find out given the preservation that we have. But I think it's important to emphasize the important role of keeping fowl because we know ethnographically they just tend to be much lower investment. There tends to be associated with the household and not sort of away from the household, right? There's all sorts of kind of really interesting theory behind, keeping of large stock versus small stock like these. And then also fish, and we don't know what kind, so just take this as a generic fish image, and rabbits that we find in this enslaved laborer context. So there is a river right there at the plantation. It's possible people are fishing nearby. It's possible they're trapping wild rabbits or keeping domestic rabbits for meat. But clearly these animals are present in the assemblage and most likely as food remains. Students did also some pretty good taxonomic analysis. Again, I think if I were teaching this course again, or when I teach this course again, I would kind of front load this and do more taxonomy earlier in the semester so that we could be more regularly identifying things like cut marks and tooth marks. They looked at skeletal representation across the animal, and they looked at sort of basic indices of preservation or weathering. There's a lot of text here, but I'm just going to talk you through results beyond what I've already said. So there's quite a large faunal assemblage from this site, which is great. There's a little over 6,000 individual bone specimens. About 20% of that was excavated by Rice just in the last few field seasons. I don't know why that is. I don't know if that's about surface area excavated or that we're curating and counting in different ways, or there's more fragmentation, which leads to higher numbers of specimens. So I can't quite explain yet why in the relatively limited Rice excavations, we've produced more fauna than I would have otherwise expected, but it's great for us. My students in the class identified a total of 247 specimens, or what we call a NISP. They noted lots of biases in their own analyses. They were quite reflective and self-critical about what they knew and didn't know and what they thought we could do in the future. And as I mentioned, I think their key finding was that clear difference in taxonomic diversity. Natalie Festa, I didn't want to put too many of her results in here because she's about to defend next week, and that's her role and not mine to present her results. But just a few things, and it would be wonderful if she could maybe present this later or write a short article or whatever. She increased the NISP substantially. She identified the minimum number of individuals. As you can see here, there's quite a few more individuals in captive labor context than in the main house. That largely has to do with the fact that there's a lot more small fauna down in the captive labor context. And she found differences between the main house and captive labor context in terms of the skeletal completeness. So how complete is your animal? How well represented are all parts of the animal? And mortality profiles in ways you might not necessarily expect. So, the sort of default expectation is that captive laborers have to do with less quality cuts of meat, and they have to make do with less than those. Ooh, sorry, I just hit something. Dang it. Let me fast forward. There we go. Sorry about that. That captive laborers may have to make do with less. They may have access to poor quality cuts of meat, those bits of bone like down here in the metapodials and phalanges that tend to have not very much meat on them, that they may have access to older animals, tougher meat, and that just really isn't borne out by our data. There's not really the expected differences, and we're trying to figure out, is that about sample size? And these are not statistically significant differences. Is it possible that enslaved laborers had access to better quality food than we might have otherwise expected? Or is it possible that those structures are actually a sort of abattoir being used for the butchery and processing of carcasses that then later will be prepared up at the main house? And these are, I think, answerable questions with sufficient sample size, and of course, a lot more work. And that's where I hope we'll be going in the future. So that brings me to kind of the end of this presentation. It is very preliminary data. And I think I've said most of what's on the slide, but just to recap, we do have these really intriguing differences that I think merit a lot more research and testing and larger sample sizes, especially from the main house. We've put our emphasis on captive labor context. We now need to study the main house and increase sample size there. We still have a long way to go, I think, in terms of figuring out what these somewhat confusing patterns are in sort of lack of differences in mortality patterns and skeletal part patterns between these different macro contexts. And I think we can't really understand what those mean without spending more time on taphonomy. So as one example of this, Natalie Festa noticed in her thesis that fauna down by the structures 1 through 3 was heavily fragmented. And one thing I said is, well, you know, people who are food insecure, food stressed, are often processing carcasses more intensively, breaking up bone and boiling it in soups and trying to sort of maximize nutritional value from animal parts. Is that what's happening here? Or are we looking at a situation of post-depositional breakage? And there are zooarchaeological tools, taphonomic tools to get at that question, but we're just not there yet. And then, of course, going back to our earlier questions, I think the next phase, and my student Maggie Katongo has started to do this, is compare the data set at Varner-Hogg with that from Levi Jordan. There's ways in which they're not directly comparable because of differences in methods and reporting, but that's clearly another phase of research. And then comparing this more broadly to other plantation contexts and against other lines of evidence. So I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. I apologize if I did, but I'm going to end it there and open it up for questions.
Hey, Mary, how much does acidity of our soil come into play with recovering older faunal remains, I guess? Some of the sites we're at, where we're only looking back 200-300 years, it doesn't seem like we're finding a lot of remains, and certainly not the older stuff compared to other places you've been.
That's a good question. So I'm thank you for saying compared to other places, because I'm going to draw on my Africa experience here and tell you that even at extremely recent Iron Age sites in East Africa, so we actually have terrible bone preservation at sites dating to within the last 400 years in East Africa compared to sites that date to tens of thousands of years ago, which seems counterintuitive, but it's all about soil acidity. And that's because people who were manufacturing iron were preferentially siting themselves on lateritic soils that, you know, those rich red soils that, you know, are great for iron production, but also are really acidic, and the bone just dissolves. So acidity is definitely going to play a role. It's not pretty. I don't know enough about Texas soils to answer that question with respect to different parts of Texas, but there's no doubt that soil acidity will wreck your bones. The good news is, you know, now we have all these other techniques. So you've got sedimentary ancient DNA, you've got, you know, biomarkers, right? There's sort of all sorts of other ways to get at least at a very coarse level, the taxonomic diversity that might have been present at a site. But then it raises all sorts of questions too about, right, if what you're interested in is human occupation, are those fauna whose remains are present in your soils related to the human activities of the site or not?
Hey, what are you looking for? I used to hunt. I don't do it anymore, but I have some friends that do exotics. And if you're not familiar, we have a lot of exotic ranches,
yes.
South Texas, the hill country, etc. Are you looking for certain exotic type animals where you could, you know, because what they'll do, you know, obviously these guys they're not necessarily killing them for the meat. They want the rack, you know, the shoulder mount, the head mount or whatever, but the rest of the animal is waste. So are you looking for stuff like that?
Absolutely. So I have driven past some of those ranches between Houston and Austin, and you can see them from the road. And I've seen the zebra out there. And yeah, I'm only limited by my own personal bandwidth I haven't had the time to look into this. And what I really need to do is sort of maybe get some students involved in this project, because I'm kind of at my maximum for what I've been able to do in just a year at Rice. But that is exactly what I'm looking for. I don't care if I don't have the crania, because crania are actually, like, first of all, the Houston Museum of Natural Sciences has a pretty good cranial collection. So if I never needed to go look at, skulls and teeth, they've got that stuff. But what we really care about as archaeologists are post-crania. So I need to find taxidermists or whoever is involved in processing these animals and discarding the bones, and hopefully start skeletonizing stuff just by burying it and then bring it to Rice. But bovids, so all the different antelopes, I know that they've got these exotic ranches. I know that kudu, impala, gazelle. Somebody saying something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so gazelles, they've got all sorts of bovids. I've seen from the road gazelles and impalas and various other antelope from a distance that I can't quite tell what they are. And then zebra, right? I mean, I would love to build up this collection, because a truly excellent zooarch lab has stuff, not just from the area that you're in, but from all over the world. So students learn comparative osteology. And because our focus at Rice is twofold. It's African archaeology and the archaeology of African American experiences and Texas history, right? So we need both, right? We need North American fauna and we need African fauna.
Mary,
Okay, cool. I'm going to a retirement gathering on Saturday night for a friend, and I know there's going to be a couple of hunters there. So
Oh, great.
I know they've
Okay.
done taxidermy over in the hill country, so possibly I can get a contact or two to.
That would be amazing. And please just feel free to email me anytime. And I'd be really happy. I'll drive places. I'll do what it takes. I've been limited basically by my time. So.
Okay, cool.
Mary,
Very good.
Mary, so what shape do you expect to get these specimens in? I mean, when you get a specimen, is this deboned? Is it just a carcass, complete, roadkill, maggot infested?
Yeah, I mean, this is it. As I hate dealing with all this stuff that you have to. So I am planning to get a big chest freezer so that I can put, not fully decomposed carcasses in it. And the other thing I need to look into, bear in mind, I've only been in Texas since August, so I'm still working on all these things, is I need to find a place where I can bury bones, because that's kind of the least stinky way of skeletonizing. So if I can get things and transport them in a safe way, right? Even if it's, still lots of flesh and stuff involved, and just bury them, nature will do its work. And in a year, especially in Texas with all the humidity and the bugs, we'll have a skeleton. So I'm not too worried about that. Boiling is another option for smaller animals, but this is just not an option for bigger game. And then dermestid beetle colonies would be kind of the next step, but I need more space at Rice to be able to do that. I don't have space in my lab for a beetle colony.
Mary, along those lines, I knew Bill McClure, and on a couple of trips over to his house, he took care of these, or skeletonized these, using those beetles. He showed us how he did that, and I think that was one of the reasons that this collection is so I don't know, pristine, I guess you'd call it, from just having it utilizing these beetles, I guess.
Yeah, beetles are definitely the way to go. So the reason I don't have beetles is because there would have been a very different structure that we would have needed in the lab, including a fume hood, which because we're in the basement of a building at Rice, it just, like, I looked into this when we were renovating the lab, and a fume hood wasn't possible. But you do want that when you've got a beetle colony. And the other problem with beetles is if they get out, you're in big trouble. So I've seen this happen in museums, and it's really bad. But I was just at Baylor University, and the zooarchaeologists over there, Joe Ferraro and Katie Benetti, have an excellent beetle colony. And actually, there is a biologist at Rice, Corey Evans, who's got a very, very little one, I think. And so I may kind of work something out with him, but he deals with fish, so his space is small. I need a big beetle bath, and maybe what Bill had was like a huge tub, right?
Hey,
It
Mary.
was, he had a couple large screens that he put these on, and cages, I guess you'd call it, and worked with the beetles and the skeleton that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a whole operation, and it's not an operation I'm willing to do at my house, honestly. But I would be willing to do it at Rice if they gave me more space and some students. So, maybe that's the next phase, but it may have to happen. Maybe that's how the collection gets grown. So. Sorry, are there questions in the chat I should be looking at too? I see stuff that's popping up. Yes, I would be totally happy to do a workshop at some point. I mean, for me, it would be great if I could do it for I can probably have a maximum of 20 people in the lab at once. And I'd be happy to do a workshop someday, either in the fall semester or in the early summer, whenever. I do think it's you can't learn a lot in a day, but you can actually learn enough that when you're on a site, you'll be like, oh, something about this. And that's really useful, right? I wish somebody had done that for me with lithics.
Was that the reply to Cynthia's question?
Jean's question.
Question.
Cynthia was
yeah.
shocked. How does a new member of AKS volunteer at your lab? And I said, basically, I think you maybe need to coordinate with HAS, and we'll organize some sort of afternoon or day or something, whatever.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. And I know that some folks here, and I'm not sure who, have been involved with Molly Morgan and the ceramics work from Varner-Hogg, for example. So I think that it's project based, but if there's, I think I don't want to promise students, because I can never guarantee in any given year. Undergraduates are so fickle. And sometimes they want to work on one thing, sometimes they want to work on another. But sometimes we have undergrads who are pretty well trained and who want to do something. And then we certainly have things that if people want to volunteer and do, fines processing or sorting and stuff like that, I'm sure we can come up with projects. But then y'all have your own materials too that you're excavating. And if you want to work with the comparative collection, for example, to do that analysis, I think we could definitely talk about that and all of those things.
I've got two questions, and Dr. Chesney popped one in there that I was going to ask. We got a program that I chair called the Academy Committee for the Texas Archaeological Society, and we put on these 2-day workshops. And finding folks to teach zooarch and osteology has long been an issue for our program. We've been working on those topics for, I would say, ever. And so it's something that we would like to do, and we could chat more about all the particulars that go into that offline.
Yeah, sure.
So maybe HA can share my contact with you. That would be
that would be great. I'd be happy to talk about that, and that sounds great. And it's the kind of thing where it's easier to do with the collections, and so I would suggest that if we were doing that, maybe depending on how many people are involved, it's physically in the space at Rice. As long as I can fit it into my crazy schedule and somebody can watch my kids, it's great by me. I love doing this stuff, and so we've got a lot of material that can be used for practice. And I do think it's the kind of thing where pretty rapidly you can learn some useful skills.
Absolutely. Right. As just to jump, Jimmy is the chair of the TAS Academies Committee. And it's true. And basically the way the academies work is they're sort of they essentially happen over a weekend. Usually there's a Friday night sort of meet and greet, and then it's all day Saturday and a good chunk of Sunday. And we limit the numbers, but it would be a perfect thing to be to set one up for the Rice Lab. People can be in there for a day long work and then a discussion and stuff like that. But it would be
sounds really fun.
It'd be very cool to work towards that.
It'd be super fun.
Do it, Mary. Do
it. A question suggestion. So if you're soliciting, critters, so maybe put out a call for critters, and it'd be good to do a blurb, not only in the HAS newsletter, but you've got the president of TAS and the past president of TAS here. I'm sure they can get one in the state newsletter.
Yeah.
I can help you get one in another newsletter. So if you have interest, we can kind of get that word out. And there's a lot of folks, not in this kind of limited group here, who probably have collections that they'd be interested to donate. So that might be a consideration.
Yeah.
That would be great. And I would love that. Thank you. And then we can talk about like what we would need, because I know that lots of folks have trophy heads that somebody doesn't want on the wall of their house, and it's in a box.
Mary.
But I don't want those because I have no wall space, but I do want postcrania. Yeah, sorry.
Hey, Mary, I
Yeah.
can put you in direct contact with the source. My sister owns Bay Area Deer Processing, so
Oh, wow.
I can get you
Okay.
anything that's been brought in.
Okay,
From bison
great.
to elk to axes, pigs,
Awesome.
anything.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
It
That
goes
would
in
be
the bone
great.
barrel and goes in the dumpster.
Such a shame.
So
Such a shame. And I mean, so the key, like, if I can start to get picky, it's really great to be able to like separate out individuals and know how big they were and what sex they were and how old they were when they died approximately and all those kinds of things. And so it might be the kind of thing too, where if I can find a student who's not squeamish and is interested in this, they might be able to go and sort of record everything that's happening as these bones get chucked into the barrel. Because I imagine multiple individuals get mingled together and stuff. And then that's like, from our point of view, that's like, oh no, we don't want that, right? Because we need to know these bones are from this individual and these are from that individual. But we can get students involved to, sort of monitor that and collect bones for whole individuals together. Be really fun.
I would suggest too that you might find yourself potentially drowning in feral hog carcasses too in this part of the world. So,
well, I know
we'd like to get rid of them. We don't really know what to do with the bodies afterwards.
That's what Catherine Jalbert told me. I've heard this about your feral hogs here in Texas, but at this point, I have 1.5 pigs. So I am still open.
We can
to
help with
pigs.
yeah.
To some extent, feral hogs. I'd actually be really interested to know how different skeletally feral hogs are from our highly industrialized domestic pigs. I mean, I sort of know because I know what Spanish wild boars look like compared to Spanish domestic pigs, but I don't know in Texas. But I'd be really interested in knowing all that.
Hey, Mary, I live up in Spring, and there's a place about 2 miles from me called Fisher Hams and Meat. Remember that, Fisher Hams and Meat. It's been around for about 100 years. It was the only building up in Spring through like the 1940s. But that's what they do is they deer process. I think they have their own domestic hogs up there, and they will process your feral hogs too. But just like everybody's been talking, all that waste product goes in a dumpster out back that's picked up every week.
Yeah.
So if you're looking to get the difference between those two, that may be a place to contact. And
that is really, I'm going to write this down.
meat.
I'm writing this down, but I'm also depending on the fact that this is still being recorded. And so maybe I can just go back later and take
I can always email you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
They're
on
in Spring,
that note-
Texas. Yeah, up in Spring, Texas. Yeah.
And on that note, y'all, I'm going to
Okay.
bring the actual recording to a close, but I'm going to leave the Zoom open so y'all can chit chat as long as you like. But that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you, HAS and the HAS board. We'll see y'all at the next meeting.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, everybody.
Liz.